"Let's be honest, Mom," Marcus announced, pushing away his half-eaten Thanksgiving turkey as his wife Vanessa nodded in agreement. "You're becoming a burden we can't afford. Either move in with Richard and his family, or we'll need to discuss assisted living options." He trailed off, eyeing the modest surroundings of my small craftsman home with barely concealed disdain. "You clearly can't maintain this place anymore. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." I didn't shout. I didn't shed a tear. I simply set down my fork, dabbed my lips with the embroidered napkin my late husband Gregory had given me on our 30th anniversary, and smiled. "I appreciate your concern," I said calmly. By Monday morning, I had contacted my financial advisor, revealed my carefully guarded $3 million portfolio, and placed a down payment on a luxury condo overlooking the Pacific in Del Mar Shores. The look on Marcus's face 3 weeks later when I handed him the keys to my burdensome home as a parting gift, telling him I wouldn't be needing it at my new oceanfront property, was worth every penny of the 30 years I'd spent building my secret fortune. If you're enjoying this story already, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's story about a grandmother's revenge on her gold-digging in-laws will leave you speechless. I never imagined I'd celebrate my 70th birthday watching dolphins leap from the waves of my private balcony, sipping champagne that cost more than the monthly mortgage payment on the home I'd lived in for 45 years. After a lifetime of careful frugality, clipping coupons, buying generic brands, wearing clothes until they were threadbare, the luxury still felt foreign, almost forbidden. But as I stood there, watching the December sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and rose, I couldn't help but smile at the delicious irony of it all. For decades, I had maintained the appearance of careful middle-class modesty, while secretly building wealth that none of my children, especially not Marcus, had ever suspected. It began 2 years after Gregory died of a sudden heart attack. I was 42, with 3 children still at home and a modest life insurance policy that barely covered the funeral expenses. Gregory had been a high school science teacher, beloved by his students but certainly not well compensated. I worked part-time as a librarian at the community college, a job I'd taken to have flexible hours for the children. What nobody knew, not even Gregory, was that I had inherited a small parcel of land outside of Phoenix from my eccentric uncle, Walter, when I was just 25. At the time, it was worthless desert scrubland, not even worth mentioning. I'd almost forgotten about it myself until a developer called one afternoon, offering what seemed like an astronomical sum for what was now prime real estate for a new planned community. The windfall wasn't massive, just $180,000, but it was enough to spark an idea. Instead of merging it with our family finances or splurging on a nicer house, I made a decision that would shape the next 3 decades of my life. I kept it secret. I opened a separate investment account under my maiden name, Parker, and began to educate myself about personal finance. Nights were spent after the children went to bed, poring over investment books borrowed from the very library where I worked. Weekends included seminars at the community college on financial literacy. I learned about compound interest, dividend reinvestment, tax-advantaged accounts, and the power of consistent, disciplined investing. While maintaining our simple lifestyle, I methodically built my hidden portfolio. When I received a small raise at work, the difference went straight to my investments. Birthday checks from my parents, tax refunds, even the dollars saved from using coupons at the grocery store, all funneled into what I came to think of as my freedom fund. I never intended the deception to last so long. Initially, I thought of it as a safety net, a way to ensure my children would never be homeless if tragedy struck again. But as the years passed and my investments grew, I noticed troubling patterns emerging in my son Marcus. Of my 3 children, Marcus had Gregory's sharp intellect, but none of his father's compassion or work ethic. He gravitated toward shortcuts, expected rewards without effort, and developed an alarming sense of entitlement. During his college years, I received calls from the university about unpaid bills that we'd already sent money for. After graduation, he worked through a series of jobs, each ending with a story about unfair treatment or unappreciative bosses. When he married Vanessa, a beautiful, polished woman with expensive tastes and a family that had lost their wealth. In a series of bad investments, I watched with concern as they established a lifestyle well beyond their means. The luxury cars with burdensome loans, the vacations funded by credit cards, the house in Greenfield Heights with the underwater mortgage, all warning signs I recognized from my financial education, but couldn't address without revealing my own financial reality. Occasionally, they would call with temporary emergencies, house repairs, car troubles, unexpected medical bills not covered by insurance. I helped when I could from my visible finances, my librarian's salary and modest pension, but I maintained firm boundaries that frustrated Marcus deeply. "I don't understand why you're so tight with money, Mom," he complained during one such call. "It's not like you're going to take it with you when you go." "I need to ensure I can take care of myself until I go," I replied simply, not mentioning that his sisters, Rachel and Olivia, never seemed to have these same emergencies despite similar salaries. As I entered my late 60s, I began to carefully plan my transition to retirement. My secret portfolio had grown beyond anything I could have imagined. Frugal living combined with careful investing during the market's strongest decades had worked financial magic. My original inheritance had multiplied many times over, creating a nest egg that would allow me not just comfort, but true luxury in my final decades. Meanwhile, I maintained the narrative of modest, careful retirement planning in my visible finances, letting Marcus and Vanessa believe I was just getting by. I stayed in my aging craftsman home with its creaky floors and outdated kitchen, drove a 10-year-old Toyota, and continued to use coupons at the grocery store. Until that Thanksgiving dinner, when everything changed. If you've ever felt undervalued by someone who should appreciate you the most, this story might resonate deeply with you. Before I continue, I want to thank everyone who's watching this from around the world. I see comments coming in from Australia, Germany, Canada, and dozens of other countries. It's amazing how these experiences connect us all. If you're new here, welcome to Real Life Resilience, where we share authentic stories of people who turned painful moments into powerful transformations. I'm Jessica Montgomery, and I believe that every setback can become the foundation for an incredible comeback. This particular story touched me personally because it reminds me so much of my own grandmother, a woman of quiet strength who never revealed her full power until it was absolutely necessary. There's something incredibly satisfying about seeing someone underestimated finally step into the light of their own worth, isn't there? I want to hear your thoughts on this situation so far. Would you have revealed your financial situation earlier? Or do you understand why our storyteller kept her success private for so long? Share your perspective in the comments. I read every single one. For those wondering what happened before this Thanksgiving confrontation, let me assure you that in just a moment, we'll dive deeper into the events leading up to this turning point. You'll understand exactly why this relationship had deteriorated and what pushed Marcus to make such a callous statement to his own mother. If this is your first time with us, you'll quickly discover that our community values respectful discussion about complex family dynamics. We don't demonize people here. Even Marcus and Vanessa have their own story. But we do celebrate those who find the courage to set healthy boundaries and honor their own worth. While you're sharing your thoughts in the comments, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and notification bell. Every Wednesday and Sunday, we bring you a new story of resilience, reinvention, and sometimes, like today, a perfectly satisfying moment of poetic justice that will leave you smiling. Many of you have been asking about our special series on financial independence for women over 60. As this story unfolds, you'll see some brilliant strategies that could inspire your own financial journey. I've included links in the description to some free resources on late life investing and protecting your assets as you age. For those following along on our podcast version, you can find visual elements of this story on our website, including images of Del Mar shores, where our protagonist found her beautiful oceanfront condo. The sunrise photos she's shared with us are absolutely breathtaking. I particularly love this story because it challenges so many assumptions about aging women. Society often renders women invisible as they grow older, expecting them to shrink into background roles: the helpful grandmother, the burden, the afterthought. But as you'll see, this remarkable woman had been quietly building her empire all along, demonstrating extraordinary discipline and foresight. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Some of you have already guessed parts of what happens next, but I promise there are surprising twists you won't anticipate. The way she handles the revelation of her wealth shows a masterclass in setting boundaries with dignity and without vindictiveness. Before we continue, I want to acknowledge that family estrangements are painful and complex. While this story has elements of satisfaction and justice that make for compelling viewing, we recognize that real-life family conflicts rarely have such clean resolutions. If you're struggling with similar family dynamics, we've included resources for family therapy and mediation services in our description. I'm seeing comments asking if this story is entirely true. While we've changed names, locations, and identifying details to protect privacy, the core events happened as described. We verify all stories before sharing them, though we recognize that personal narratives always reflect individual perspectives. For those of you requesting more content about late-in-life transformations, you'll be pleased to know we have an entire playlist dedicated to reinvention after 60. The link appears now on your screen and in the description below. Our storyteller has also generously offered to answer select questions about her investment strategy, though she's understandably private about specific financial details. If you have questions about how she managed to build wealth on a librarian's salary, leave them with Ask the Investor in your comment, and we'll compile them for her response in a follow-up video. Now, let's return to our story and discover exactly what happened during that fateful Thanksgiving dinner, the last one she would ever host in her modest craftsman home. The details of what was said and how our protagonist maintained her composure while her son dismantled decades of relationship reveals much about both their characters. Some viewers have asked if there were warning signs before this confrontation. As we continue, you'll learn about the subtle and not-so-subtle changes in Marcus's behavior over the years, the small betrayals and disappointments that accumulated like interest on a debt that could never be repaid. You'll also understand why she chose to maintain the appearance of modest means for so long, even as her investment portfolio flourished in secret. Her reasons go beyond simple privacy. They reflect deep insights about human nature and the corrupting influence that money can sometimes have on family relationships. For our regular viewers who enjoy the financial aspects of these stories, I'll be sharing a special breakdown of the investment principles she followed in our Financial Freedom Friday segment this week. It's remarkable how consistent small actions maintained over decades can create such extraordinary results. I see some of you asking about Marcus's sisters, Rachel and Olivia, and what their relationships with their mother looked like. Don't worry. Their part in this story will become clear as we continue, and the contrast between their behavior and their brothers is both illuminating and heartwarming. The comments are flooding in now, and I'm seeing so many of you sharing similar experiences with entitled family members. Remember that you're never alone in these struggles, and sometimes the most powerful response to disrespect is simply thriving on your own terms. Let's continue now with our story, returning to that tension-filled Thanksgiving table where decades of unspoken resentments were about to surface in ways that would permanently alter a family's dynamic. Watch closely for the subtle power shifts that occur even before our protagonist reveals her financial truth. As we move forward, notice the Language Marcus uses, the way he positions himself as the concerned son while simultaneously undermining his mother's autonomy. These linguistic patterns often reveal deeper attitudes about aging, gender, and family obligation that many of you will recognize from your own experiences. Thank you for your patience during this brief pause. Your engagement makes these stories come alive, and your shared experiences in the comments create a powerful community of support for everyone facing similar challenges. Now, let's return to our storyteller as she faces the moment that would ultimately lead to her remarkable new beginning. I was born Martha Elizabeth Parker in a small town outside of Portland in 1952, the only daughter of a high school English teacher and a telephone operator. My parents weren't wealthy, but they instilled in me the values that would ultimately build my fortune: patience, discipline, and the ability to delay gratification for greater rewards later. Always have something that belongs only to you, Martha. My mother would whisper as she tucked a dollar bill into a small wooden box she kept hidden beneath her sweaters. I didn't understand then that I was witnessing a woman with limited options creating her own security in the only way available to her. Growing up in the 1950s and 60s meant specific expectations for women. Education was fine, encouraged even, but primarily as a path to finding a suitable husband. I dutifully followed this script, earning my degree in English literature and meeting Gregory Sullivan during my junior year at Westlake College. Gregory was brilliant, kind, thoughtful, with a passion for science that made his eyes light up when he described the structure of DNA or the mysteries of quantum physics. We married 2 months after graduation in a simple ceremony in my parents' backyard, surrounded by marigolds my father had planted specially for the occasion. For the first year, we both taught at the same high school, Gregory in the science department, me in English. When I discovered I was pregnant with Rachel, our oldest, the principal gently suggested it would be inappropriate for me to continue teaching with a visible condition. It wasn't a request. By the time Marcus was born 2 years later, followed by Olivia 3 years after that, I had settled into the role of homemaker, with occasional substitute teaching to supplement Gregory's income. Those early years were lean, but happy. Our first home was a small 2-bedroom rental that barely contained our growing family. We saved every possible penny for a down payment, often eating beans and rice for dinner, turning down thermostats in winter, and becoming experts at repurposing everything from baby clothes to furniture found on curbs. When Gregory was offered a position at Lakeside High School with a substantial salary increase, we finally purchased our modest craftsman home in the older part of Oakland Hills. It wasn't prestigious, but it was ours. A 1930s 3-bedroom with generous windows and built-in bookshelves that Gregory and I immediately filled with our combined collections. Financial education wasn't common for women of my generation. My own mother balanced her checkbook meticulously but knew nothing of investments or compound interest. What little I knew came from necessity after my father died suddenly when I was 19, leaving my mother with an inadequate pension and considerable medical debt. I watched her struggle for years afterward, taking on extra shifts at the telephone company, carefully counting pennies at the grocery store. This won't be my story, I promised myself, though I had no clear idea how to ensure that. The unexpected inheritance from Uncle Walter seemed almost mystical in its timing. Walter had been the family eccentric, my father's older brother, who headed west during the Dust Bowl and cobbled together a living through a series of odd ventures. The family largely considered him a failure, a cautionary tale about impracticality. Nobody was particularly interested in the worthless desert parcels he'd accumulated during his later years. When his estate attorney contacted me, the only relative, who had maintained correspondence with Walter in his final years, I almost declined the inheritance. What use was barren land hours from any major city? But something stopped me. Perhaps it was Uncle Walter's last letter, in which he'd written, "Land is the only thing they aren't making any more of, Marty. Remember that." So I accepted the inheritance but told no one, not even Gregory. It wasn't a deliberate deception. Initially, just something that seemed unimportant given our daily financial struggles with 3 young children, a mortgage, and Gregory's aging car that constantly needed repairs. When the developer's call came 5 years later, I was home alone. The children at school, Gregory at a teachers' conference in San Diego. The offer, $180,000 for land I'd never even visited, seemed almost fictional. I remember sitting at our kitchen table, the avocado green phone pressed to my ear, asking the man to repeat the figure, certain I'd misheard. "The area is booming, Mrs. Sullivan," the developer explained. "Your parcel is perfectly positioned for our new planned community. We've already secured the surrounding properties." I asked for time to consider, though in truth, I made my decision. Within moments of hanging up. This money would not disappear into our daily needs. It would not fund a slightly better car or a kitchen renovation or even the children's college funds. This money would be my invisible armor against an uncertain future. The decision to keep the windfall separate wasn't rooted in distrust of Gregory. I loved my husband deeply and knew he was as committed to our family's security as I was. But I had also absorbed my mother's quiet anxiety, had seen how quickly security could evaporate for women who had no resources of their own. With the sale finalized, I made an appointment at Westlake Financial Services, a firm several towns away where I was unlikely to encounter anyone who knew me. The financial advisor, Mr. Harrison, was initially condescending, suggesting certificates of deposit or a simple savings account. When I inquired about investment options with better returns, he looked at me over his reading glasses with thinly veiled amusement. "These more advanced instruments require active management and a longer time horizon, Mrs. Sullivan. Perhaps your husband would like to join us for this conversation." "My husband is deceased," I lied, feeling a momentary stab of guilt. "I'm managing my late uncle's bequest independently." His demeanor shifted immediately, and the educational component of our meeting improved considerably. I left with a diversified portfolio, a stack of prospectuses to study, and a growing sense of empowerment I hadn't anticipated. That might have been the end of it, a modest, separate investment that I would eventually reveal to Gregory when it had grown enough to make a meaningful difference in our lives. But 2 events in quick succession altered my course. First, Gregory's colleague Thomas Wilkins died suddenly of a heart attack at age 45, leaving his family with insufficient life insurance and a mountain of debt. I watched his widow Carol sell their home, move her 3 children into a small apartment, and take on 2 jobs to survive. Second, I discovered a letter from a collection agency while sorting through bills. Gregory had taken a personal loan to cover some investment with a colleague, an opportunity he'd never mentioned. The investment had apparently failed, and the $3,000 debt, a considerable sum in 1980, was now 3 months overdue. When confronted, Gregory was apologetic but defensive. "I was trying to get ahead for once, Martha. Do you know how demoralizing it is to watch other men advance while I'm stuck counting pennies? It was supposed to be a surprise for you when it paid off." We eventually resolved the debt by cashing out the small stock portfolio Gregory's parents had given us as a wedding present. But something fundamental had shifted in my understanding of our partnership. Even the best intentions could lead to financial vulnerability. Even the most loving husband could make decisions that endangered our security. I never told Gregory about Uncle Walter's land or the growing investment account. Each year, as our tax returns needed filing, I maintained the fiction that my occasional substitute teaching and later my part-time library position accounted for my modest separate income. Gregory, brilliant in science but intimidated by financial matters, was content to let me manage this aspect of our lives. The children grew, as children do, each developing their own relationship with money that fascinated me in its divergence. Rachel, our oldest, inherited my caution and Gregory's analytical mind. By age 10, she maintained meticulous records of her allowance and babysitting income, setting aside a fixed percentage in a savings account for future goals. Olivia, our youngest, was neither spendthrift nor particularly frugal. She simply seemed uninterested in material possessions, preferring experiences and relationships to objects. She would save intensely for specific goals, a school trip to Washington, D.C., a specialized summer camp for aspiring journalists, but otherwise remained indifferent to money's accumulation. Marcus was different from the beginning. Money slipped through his fingers like water, disappearing into comic books, video games, and later, expensive sneakers and status symbols that seemed to provide only momentary satisfaction. He developed elaborate justifications for why he needed more than his siblings, why his expenses were uniquely necessary and urgent. "He's just finding himself," Gregory would say when I expressed concern about Marcus's growing sense of entitlement. "Boys need to establish their identity through these external symbols. He'll outgrow it." But as Marcus entered adolescence, the pattern only intensified. While his sisters worked summer jobs and saved for college, Marcus cycled through brief employment stints that always ended with some injustice or conflict that, in his telling, made it impossible to continue. He expected, and received, frequent loans from Gregory that we both knew would never be repaid. My secret portfolio continued to grow through careful management and regular contributions. When I began working at the Oakmont Community College library, I arranged for a portion of my salary to be directly deposited into my investment account. Every raise, every bit of extra income, every tax refund, all funneled into what I now thought of as my just-in-case fund. Just in case Gregory became ill. Just in case the economy collapsed. Just in case one of the children faced a true emergency. Just in case I ended up alone. The last just in case arrived sooner than any of us could have imagined. Gregory collapsed while writing test questions at his desk one Sunday afternoon. By the time the ambulance arrived, he was gone. A massive heart attack at age 49, leaving me a widow at 42 with 3 children still at home and a lifetime of plans, suddenly evaporated. Gregory's death changed everything and nothing. The crushing grief and sudden responsibilities were overwhelming, but financially, I was more prepared than anyone, including Gregory, could have imagined. While the modest life insurance policy barely covered the funeral expenses and 3 months of mortgage payments, my secret account had grown to just over $320,000 by then. I never considered using it immediately. The financial cushion gave me the peace of mind to grieve properly, to be present for my children as they processed the loss of their father, without the desperate panic I witnessed in other widows from our social circle. But outwardly, I maintained our same careful lifestyle, explaining to friends and family that Gregory's pension and my increased hours at the library would keep us afloat. "Mom's so brave," I overheard Rachel telling her friend one afternoon. "She never complains, but I know she's worried about money. That's why I'm applying for more scholarships." Rachel was heading to college the following year. She'd been accepted to Berkeley with a partial academic scholarship. Olivia was 14, already focused on her journalism dreams, saving her babysitting money for a proper camera. Marcus, at 16, was increasingly difficult, his grief manifesting as anger, his relationship with money becoming even more problematic. Within weeks of Gregory's death, Marcus asked for an expensive new gaming system, arguing that it would help distract him from his loss. When I gently suggested we wait until Christmas, he exploded. "Dad would have understood. You've always been the cheap one." The words stung, not because they were true, but because they revealed how thoroughly Marcus had misunderstood our family's financial values. Gregory and I had been united in our approach to money, cautious, thoughtful, prioritizing security and education over material goods. But somehow, Marcus had constructed a narrative where I was the obstacle to his desires, the unreasonable gatekeeper of resources that should naturally flow his way. That moment crystallized something for me. My secret fund wasn't just insurance against financial disaster, it was protection against emotional manipulation as well. If Marcus knew there was money available, his requests would only escalate. His sense of entitlement would grow, and the important lessons about self-reliance that Gregory and I had tried to instill would be permanently undermined. So I maintained our modest lifestyle through the children's high school and college years, working full-time at the library, carefully managing Gregory's pension and our visible savings. When Rachel needed a bit extra for textbooks, when Olivia's journalism internship in Washington, D.C. required a security deposit for an apartment, I found ways to help that appeared to stretch our limited resources rather than reveal the growing investment account. Marcus presented different challenges. He attended State University, changing majors 3 times before settling on business administration. His monthly allowance, the same amount his sisters had received, was allegedly insufficient for his networking needs. Phone calls often began with casual conversation before pivoting to some unexpected expense or opportunity that required immediate financial assistance. "It's an investment in my future, Mom," he would say, a phrase that became more frequent as his graduation approached with no clear career path in sight. I helped when the needs seemed legitimate: a professional wardrobe for interviews, a security deposit for his first apartment, even a used car to commute to his first real job at Meridian Financial Services. But I maintained clear boundaries that increasingly frustrated him. "Richard's parents bought him a condo," he complained, referring to his longtime friend. "They understand that real estate is the best investment. You've got that big house all to yourself. You could downsize and help me get established properly." "I'm comfortable in my home," I replied, "and I need to ensure my own security for the years ahead." This became a recurring theme. Marcus's assumption that my assets should naturally flow to him, that my financial security was less important than his immediate desires. He viewed money not as something earned through effort and discipline, but as a resource to be extracted from various sources: parents, credit cards, future earnings assumed but not yet realized. When Marcus met Vanessa Harrington at a financial industry event, I had hopes that her influence might be positive. She came from what had once been considerable wealth. Her father had been a successful investment banker before a series of poor decisions decimated the family fortune. Vanessa had grown up with privilege, then watched it disappear, an experience I thought might have taught valuable lessons about financial fragility. I was wrong. Instead of caution, Vanessa seemed determined to recapture the lifestyle she felt entitled to, regardless of whether their combined income could support it. Within a year of dating, they were living in a luxury apartment in Greenfield Heights, driving high-end leased vehicles, and taking Instagram-worthy vacations funded primarily by credit cards. Their wedding was an extravagant affair that I later learned left them with significant debt. My gift, a check for $10,000 that represented the upper limit of what could reasonably come from my librarian's salary and careful saving, was acknowledged with barely concealed disappointment. The Hendersons gave their daughter twice this amount, Vanessa mentioned casually during the rehearsal dinner, examining the check before tucking it into her designer clutch. "The Hendersons are orthopedic surgeons," I reminded her gently. "I'm a librarian." The subtle dynamics shifted further after they married. Our Sunday dinners became showcases for their latest acquisitions: designer watches, premium appliances, exclusive club memberships, each presented with casual mentions of cost that seemed calculated to emphasize the growing gap between our lifestyles. "You should treat yourself, Martha," Vanessa would say, noting my practical clothing or reliable but aging Toyota. "You work so hard. Don't you want to enjoy life a little?" The implication was clear. My frugality was a character flaw, a failure to properly value myself rather than a conscious choice with purpose behind it. I didn't bother explaining that my contentment came precisely from the security I had built, from knowing that whatever happened, I would never be a burden to my children or dependent on others' goodwill. As my 60s approached, the invisible divide between my financial reality and my children's perception of it grew wider. My investment portfolio, managed with increasing sophistication as my knowledge expanded, had grown beyond anything I could have imagined when Uncle Walter's land sale provided its seed. The original $180,000 had multiplied many times over through carefully researched investments in technology companies, pharmaceutical research, and yes, strategic real estate holdings managed through blind trusts to maintain my privacy. Rachel and her husband David, both professors at small colleges in Vermont, lived modestly but comfortably, prioritizing experiences with their 2 children over material possessions. They rarely discussed money during our weekly phone calls, and when they did visit, they always insisted on covering groceries and treating me to meals out, despite my protests. Olivia had followed her journalistic ambitions to a successful career, with Reuters, her assignments taking her around the world. Single by choice and delightfully independent, she maintained a small apartment in New York as her home base. When she called, it was to share adventures or seek advice about ethical dilemmas in her reporting, never to discuss financial matters. Marcus and Vanessa's trajectory was markedly different. Their financial difficulties became increasingly apparent, despite their efforts to maintain appearances. The hints began subtly. Offhand comments about the ridiculous cost of their country club dues, complaints about property tax increases on their home, sighs about private school tuition for their daughter Sophia. Then came the more direct approaches. Marcus called one evening, his voice casual but strained, to discuss an investment opportunity that required immediate capital. When I asked for details, the story shifted to an unexpected tax bill that had caught them unprepared. Could I help? Just this once? I agreed to lend them $5,000, an amount that seemed significant enough to help but not so large it would strain my visible resources. The loan came with a clear repayment plan that Marcus agreed to enthusiastically. 3 months later, when the first payment was due, he called with another emergency. Vanessa's car needed major repairs. They'd have to delay repayment until the following month. The following month brought another excuse, then another. The pattern was established. When I finally brought up the unpaid loan during a Sunday dinner at their home, Marcus became defensive. "We're going through a rough patch, Mom. Vanessa's father was supposed to help with an investment that fell through, and the market's been brutal this quarter. If you really need that money back, we can discuss liquidating some assets. But honestly, I thought you were in a better position than that." "It's not about needing the money back immediately," I explained carefully. "It's about honoring commitments and maintaining clear boundaries." Marcus looked genuinely perplexed. "But we're family. Isn't family supposed to help each other without all these formal arrangements?" The question revealed so much about our fundamental disconnect. His perception of family as an unlimited resource to be tapped without reciprocal obligation. My understanding of family as a network of mutual respect with each member's needs and boundaries equally valid. The rough patch, apparently, continued indefinitely. The requested loans became more frequent, the amounts larger, the justifications more elaborate. Each time, I provided what seemed reasonable from my supposed financial position, but maintained firm boundaries that increasingly frustrated Marcus and Vanessa. "I don't understand why you're being so rigid about this," Marcus complained after I declined to co-sign a consolidation loan for their credit card debt. "You own your house outright. Your expenses are minimal. You could help us get through this difficult period if you wanted to." "I'm helping as much as I can while ensuring my own future security," I replied. "At my age, I need to be certain I won't become dependent on any of you children if my health declines." This comment, perfectly reasonable from a 68-year-old widow, living on a librarian's pension, was met with an eye roll from Vanessa and a dismissive wave from Marcus. "You're healthier than most people half your age, Mom, and if anything did happen, we'd take care of you. That's what family does." The irony was almost painful. Here was my son, unable to manage his own finances despite a 6-figure income, confidently assuring me that he would take care of me if necessary. The very scenario my decades of careful financial planning had been designed to prevent. As my 70th birthday approached, the dynamic deteriorated further. Marcus and Vanessa began commenting on my home's maintenance issues, a section of gutter that needed replacement, fading paint on the front porch, an outdated kitchen that was becoming a safety concern. Each observation was framed as loving concern but carried the unmistakable subtext, "You can't manage on your own anymore." "We've been thinking, Mom," Marcus said during a Sunday visit about 3 weeks before Thanksgiving. "This house is really too much for you to maintain. You should consider downsizing to something more appropriate for this stage of life." "I'm quite comfortable here," I replied, noting that the maintenance issues they identified were largely cosmetic rather than functional. "The mortgage is paid off and the location is convenient to everything I need." "But the stairs," Vanessa interjected, eyeing the carpeted staircase that led to the second floor. "As you get older, those could become dangerous. Richard's mother, you remember Richard's mother? She fell and broke her hip last year. Now she lives with them, and everyone's happier knowing she's safe." The comparison was telling. Richard's mother had moved in with her son's family after her injury, an arrangement that, according to Richard himself during a chance encounter at the grocery store, was straining both finances and relationships in ways no one had anticipated. "I appreciate your concern," I said firmly, "but I'm not ready to make any changes to my living situation." The conversation shifted, but I noticed the glance that passed between Marcus and Vanessa, a look that suggested this discussion was far from over. In the weeks leading up to Thanksgiving, I received an unusual number of calls from Marcus, each touching on my living situation, my health, my ability to manage independently. The subtle campaign was building toward something, though I wasn't yet sure what. When they insisted on hosting Thanksgiving at my house, rather than theirs as originally planned, "So you won't have to drive, Mom," I agreed, curious to see what they had in mind. I prepared the traditional meal as I had for decades, though Vanessa insisted on bringing several dishes from an expensive organic market to ease my burden. As we gathered around my dining table, Marcus, Vanessa, their daughter Sophia, and myself, Rachel and Olivia both had other commitments this year, I had no idea that the conversation was about to permanently alter our family dynamic. But I felt the tension building beneath the polite conversation, noticed the meaningful glances between Marcus and Vanessa as we finished the pumpkin pie and coffee. "Mom," Marcus finally said, setting down his dessert fork with deliberate care, "we need to talk about your future." The words hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy with unspoken intentions. I took a small sip of coffee, buying myself a moment, to observe the tableau before me. Marcus sat straight-backed, fingers drumming lightly on the tablecloth, a nervous habit he'd had since childhood. Vanessa's perfectly manicured hand rested on his forearm, a gesture that appeared supportive, but seemed more like a prompt, a silent urging to continue with their rehearsed plan. 12-year-old Sophia stared uncomfortably at her half-eaten pie, sensing the tension but unable to decipher its source. "My future?" I repeated calmly, setting down my cup on the saucer with a gentle clink that seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. "What aspect of my future concerns you?" Marcus cleared his throat, glancing briefly at Vanessa as if seeking reassurance. "Your living situation, Mom. We've been talking, and we think it's time to make some changes before there's a crisis." "I wasn't aware any crisis was imminent," I said, folding my napkin precisely, a habit Gregory had once teased me about. 4 decades later, I still heard his playful voice whenever I aligned the corners with mathematical precision. "Some things never change, Martha the meticulous." "That's just it," Vanessa interjected, her voice taking on the careful cadence she used when explaining complex financial products to clients. "The best time to make these decisions is before a crisis forces your hand. We've been researching options that would provide you with appropriate support while protecting your assets. What's left of them." The slight emphasis on what's left wasn't subtle. They had been creating a narrative about my dwindling resources for months, perhaps even believing it themselves despite the lack of evidence. I appreciate your concern, I said, but my current arrangements are quite satisfactory. Marcus leaned forward, elbows on the table, a breach of the table manners I'd spent years instilling in him. Mom, we can all see that you're struggling to maintain this place. The gutters need cleaning, the water heater is ancient, the back step has that loose board. It's becoming unsafe. I have a service coming next week for the gutters, I replied truthfully. The water heater was inspected last month and deemed in good working order, and I've already purchased the materials to fix the back step. I'm quite capable of basic home maintenance, Marcus. But should you have to deal with these things at your age? Vanessa asked, her tone suggesting this was a rhetorical question with only one reasonable answer. Wouldn't it be better to live somewhere where all of this is taken care of for you? I looked around my dining room, at the built-in cabinet that still held my grandmother's china, at the window seat where each of my children had curled up with books on rainy afternoons, at the walls that had absorbed 4 decades of family, conversations, arguments, laughter, and tears. This is my home, I said simply. I'm not ready to leave it. Marcus sighed dramatically, exchanging another glance with Vanessa. We thought you might feel that way initially. That's why we've been looking into several options that might appeal to you. He reached for his phone, opening a folder of photos which he slid across the table toward me. Lakeside Gardens. It's a very nice assisted living community about 20 minutes from our house. They have different levels of care available as needs change, and the amenities are excellent. Dining room, activities, transportation services. I glanced at the photos, generic images of smiling seniors engaged in what appeared to be a watercolor class. A restaurant-style dining room with white tablecloths, a small but tidy apartment with safety bars in the bathroom. It looked perfectly adequate and utterly soulless. I don't need assisted living, Marcus. I'm completely independent and intend to remain so. For now, Vanessa said with that same practiced patience. But realistically, Martha, you're 70. These needs can develop quite suddenly. If and when they do, I'll address them, I replied. I have long-term care insurance precisely for that eventuality. Marcus's expression shifted to one of surprise, then skepticism. Since when? That's very expensive coverage. I've had it for 15 years, I answered truthfully. It was one of the few significant expenses from my secret portfolio that I hadn't bothered to disguise. The premiums were automatically deducted from my investment account. It seemed prudent. Marcus seemed momentarily flustered by this information, but quickly regrouped. Well, that's good planning, but it doesn't solve the immediate issue. This house is too large and demanding for one person. The property taxes alone must be eating into your fixed income. I manage my expenses quite comfortably, I replied, noticing how Sophia was growing increasingly uncomfortable, pushing her pie around the plate with the edge of her fork. Sophia, sweetheart, I said gently, would you like to go watch your show in the living room? I recorded that baking competition you enjoy. She looked to her parents for permission, clearly relieved, when Vanessa nodded. As she slipped from the dining room, I felt a pang of sadness that my granddaughter was witnessing this uncomfortable dynamic between the adults in her life. Once she was out of earshot, the tenor of the conversation shifted noticeably. Let's be honest, Mom, Marcus said, his voice losing its carefully modulated concern. You're becoming a burden we can't afford. Your house is falling apart, your car is ancient, and you're too proud to admit you need help. Richard's mother moved in with them, and while it's an adjustment, everyone knows it's the sensible solution. I'm a burden? I repeated, genuinely startled by his characterization. In what way am I burdening you exactly? I pay my own bills, maintain my own home, drive myself wherever I need to go, and have never once asked you for financial assistance. Vanessa sighed heavily, her patience visibly fraying. It's the constant worry, Martha. The phone calls when something needs fixing, the outdated appliances that could malfunction and cause a fire, the front steps that are a lawsuit waiting to happen if the mail carrier slips. We have our own financial pressures with Sophia's private school tuition, and the renovations on the vacation property. I sat perfectly still, digesting the breathtaking selfishness of what I was hearing. In their worldview, my very existence in my own home constituted a burden because it created theoretical worries for them. Worries that apparently interfered with their luxury renovations and discretionary expenses. "What exactly are you proposing?" I asked, my voice steady despite the hurt and anger building inside me. "We see two options," Marcus said, shifting into his professional presentation mode. "Either you sell this house and move in with Richard's parents in their guest suite. We've already discussed it with them, and they're amenable since you and Elaine were always friendly. Or you sell the house and use the proceeds for a nice, assisted living apartment at Lakeside Gardens." "And if I choose neither of those options?" I asked. Marcus's expression hardened. "Those are the sensible options, Mom. If you're not willing to be reasonable about this, we might need to consult with an attorney about competency evaluations and conservatorship. It would be better for everyone if it didn't come to that." The threat, for that's exactly what it was, hung in the air between us. I felt a curious sense of detachment, as if I were observing the scene from a distance. My son, whom I had raised with such love, whom I had supported through every challenge and milestone, was calmly threatening to have me declared incompetent if I refused to dispose of my assets according to his preferences. "I see," I said quietly. "And what would happen to the proceeds from the house sale in either scenario?" "Well, obviously they would need to go toward your care," Vanessa replied. "Though in the case of moving in with Richard's parents, we'd handle the financial arrangements directly with them. They're asking for a very reasonable monthly contribution, considering the market rate for senior care. And if there were any remaining funds after my care was provided for," I pressed. Marcus had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "We would manage those funds for you, ensuring they were used appropriately for your needs. Anything left would eventually become part of your estate, which would come to us anyway." "I see," I repeated, each word measured and deliberate. "So to summarize, you want me to sell my home of 40 years, either move in with your friend's elderly parents, or into an assisted living facility I neither need nor want, and hand over the proceeds to you to manage, because I'm apparently incompetent to handle my own affairs, despite no evidence whatsoever of cognitive decline." "You're twisting our words," Vanessa protested, but her flush suggested I had captured their intentions. "Precisely." "Am I?" I asked, looking directly at Marcus. "Is that not exactly what you're proposing?" He shifted uncomfortably but held my gaze. "We're trying to help you, Mom. You're not thinking clearly about your situation. This house is a money pit, and you're living on a fixed income that isn't keeping pace with inflation. We're concerned about your financial security." The irony was almost painful. Here was my son, who had never managed to live within his means despite a generous income, lecturing me about financial security while eyeing my modest assets with barely concealed avarice. Something broke inside me then. Not my composure, which remained intact, but the last fragile thread of illusion about my relationship with my son. The child I had raised, the young man I had supported, the adult I had continued to help despite his poor choices. That person was gone, if he had ever truly existed. In his place sat a stranger who viewed me not as a person with my own needs and dignity, but as a resource to be managed, an inconvenience to be handled, a potential asset to be acquired. "Let's be honest," I said, echoing his earlier words with deliberate precision. "This isn't about my well-being. This is about your financial problems and your desire to access the equity in my home before I've even died." "That's not fair," Marcus protested, but his eyes slid away from mine. "Isn't it?" I asked. "When was the last time either of you offered to help with those supposedly critical home repairs you're so concerned about? When was the last time you invited me to dinner without eventually steering the conversation toward my assets or your financial difficulties?" Vanessa's mouth tightened into a thin line. "We're trying to have a reasonable adult conversation about practical matters, and you're making it emotional. This is exactly why we're concerned about your decision-making capacity. I stood up slowly, gathering the dessert plates with steady hands. I think we're done with this conversation. I'm not selling my home. I'm not moving in with Richard's parents. I'm not checking into assisted living. And I'm certainly not handing over my financial affairs to people who can't manage their own. Mom, Marcus began, his tone somewhere between angry and pleading. No, I said, with a finality that stopped him mid-sentence. I've listened to your proposal, and I'm declining it. Now, would anyone like more coffee before you leave? The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus and Vanessa exchanged glances loaded with frustration and thwarted intentions. Finally, Marcus pushed back from the table. This isn't over, Mom, he said, his voice low and controlled. You need to think seriously about your situation. You can't maintain this lifestyle on a librarian's pension forever. My financial situation is not your concern, I replied calmly, and I would appreciate it if you would respect my decisions about my own life. We'll see, Vanessa murmured, just loudly enough for me to hear, as she stood and smoothed her expensive dress. Sophia, time to go, she called toward the living room. As they gathered their belongings, the tension in the air was palpable. Sophia, sensitive child that she was, clearly sensed that something significant had transpired, though she couldn't have understood the full implications. Bye, Grandma, she said, giving me a quick hug. Thanks for Thanksgiving dinner. You're always welcome, sweetheart, I replied, holding her a moment longer than usual, wondering when, or if, I would see her again after this confrontation. At the door, Marcus paused, turning back with a final salvo. Think about what we've discussed. Mom, we're only trying to help before things get worse. You're not getting any younger, and frankly, you're becoming a burden that we can't manage while dealing with our own financial responsibilities. There it was again, that word, burden. As if my very existence, my temerity in continuing to live, independently in my own home, constituted an imposition on their lives. Goodbye, Marcus, I said simply, closing the door behind them with quiet finality. In the sudden silence of my empty house, I leaned against the door, allowing myself to feel the full weight of what had just transpired. My son had revealed himself completely today, not as the loving, concerned child he portrayed himself to be, but as someone who viewed his aging mother primarily as a financial resource to be tapped, an inconvenience to be managed, a burden to be shifted elsewhere so as not to impede his own material ambitions. The pain was acute but clarifying. For years, I had maintained the pretense of modest means, partly out of ingrained habit, and partly from a vague, unexamined fear that financial transparency might damage my relationships with my children. Now I understood with perfect clarity that with Marcus, at least, the pretense had served a vital purpose. It had revealed his true character in a way that mere suspicion never could. As I gathered the remaining dishes and began to wash them, by hand, a meditative practice I had maintained despite Vanessa's repeated suggestions that I treat myself to a dishwasher, I made a decision. The time for pretense was over. Not because Marcus deserved to know the truth about my financial situation, but because I deserved to live the remainder of my life in full authenticity, without the constraints of an identity I had outgrown. Would call my financial advisor first thing Monday morning. After 30 years of secrecy, it was time to step fully into the life my prudence and foresight had created. Not to impress my son or change his fundamentally flawed perception of me, but to honor the woman I had become through decades of quiet, discipline, and careful planning. The thought brought an unexpected smile to my lips as I dried the last plate and returned it to the cabinet. Marcus had called me a burden, the most painful insult he could imagine. He had no idea that in 3 decades of managing my secret fortune, I had accumulated enough wealth to purchase his entire lifestyle many times over. The weekend after Thanksgiving passed in a curious state of calm. I had expected to feel devastated, by Marcus's cruel assessment of me as a burden, had anticipated hours of tears and second-guessing. Instead, I experienced a profound sense of clarity and purpose I hadn't felt since the early days after Gregory's death, when the children's immediate needs had given me no choice but to move forward decisively. On Friday morning, I rose early, made a strong cup of coffee, and sat at my small kitchen desk with a legal pad. The time for half measures and pretense was over. I needed a comprehensive plan to reclaim my life and set appropriate boundaries, financial, emotional, and practical. First, I called Rachel in Vermont. Our weekly calls usually happened on Sunday evenings, so my Friday morning call caught her by surprise. "Mom, is everything okay?" The immediate concern in her voice made me realize how rarely I initiated contact outside our routine. "Everything's fine, sweetheart," I assured her. "I just wanted to hear your voice and check on you and the family." Our conversation flowed naturally through updates about her children's school activities, David's latest research project, and the early snow that had already blanketed their small Vermont town. I found myself lingering on details I might normally have passed over, savoring the easy warmth between us. "How was Thanksgiving with Marcus and Vanessa?" she asked eventually. "I'm sorry we couldn't make it this year. The kids were so disappointed to miss your pumpkin pie." I hesitated, unsure how much to share. Rachel and Marcus had a cordial, but distant relationship. Their fundamentally different values creating a natural buffer that had only widened in adulthood. "It was enlightening," I said finally. "We had a difficult conversation about my living situation. Marcus feels I should sell the house and either move in with Richard's parents or into assisted living." Rachel's sharp intake of breath was audible even through the phone line. "That's ridiculous. You're completely independent and competent. Why would you need assisted living?" "Apparently, I'm becoming a burden they can't afford," I said, surprised by how steady my voice remained despite the hurt those words still carried. "A burden?" Rachel repeated, her tone making it clear how absurd she found the characterization. "In what possible way are you burdening them? You've never asked any of us for anything." "That's what I said," I replied, warmed by her immediate understanding and support. "But in their perspective, my continued independence in this house creates worry for them that interferes with their financial priorities. Like the vacation property renovations Vanessa keeps posting about on social media?" Rachel asked dryly. "Or Sophia's ridiculously expensive private school that Marcus constantly humble brags about at family gatherings?" I couldn't help but smile at her perceptiveness. "Among other things, yes." "Oh, Mom," Rachel sighed. "I'm so sorry they put you through that. What did you tell them?" "I declined their help, of course," I said. "But the conversation made me realize it's time for some changes in how I approach my relationship with Marcus. And actually, there are some things I should tell you and Olivia as well. Things I've kept private for a very long time." "That sounds ominous," Rachel said, her tone shifting to concern again. "Are you sure you're okay?" "I'm more than okay," I assured her. "But I'd prefer to have this conversation when we can all be together. Are you still planning to visit at Christmas?" "Absolutely. We've already bought the train tickets. Olivia mentioned she'd be there too. She's between assignments for the first time in ages." "Perfect," I said. "We'll talk then. In the meantime, please don't mention this conversation to Marcus. I need some time to get certain things in order." After speaking with Rachel, I called Olivia, catching her during a layover at Heathrow on her way back from an assignment in Berlin. Our conversation followed similar contours, the easy exchange of updates and affection, my brief mention of the difficult Thanksgiving conversation, her immediate protectiveness and concern. "Do you want me to call him?" Olivia asked, her journalist's directness apparent even through the slightly staticky international connection. "I can be very persuasive when people are being unreasonable." I laughed, picturing my youngest daughter, all 5 feet 2 inches of her, confronting her much taller brother with the same fearless intensity she brought to interviewing world leaders and corporate titans. "No, darling, I can handle Marcus, but I would appreciate your discretion until Christmas. There are some family matters I'd like to discuss when we're all together." With my daughters informed, at least partially, of the situation, I turned my attention to the most important call of the day. Philip Harrison, my financial advisor of 30 years, answered on the second ring despite the holiday weekend. "Martha, wonderful to hear from you. How was your Thanksgiving?" "Illuminating," I replied. "Philip, I need to make some significant changes to my financial arrangements, and I'd like to meet as soon as possible to discuss them." If he was surprised by my direct approach, so different from my usual cautious, incremental decision-making, he didn't show it. "Of course, I have some time this afternoon if that works for you. Say, 2 o'clock? "Perfect. And Philip? I'll need comprehensive documentation of my portfolio. Every account, every investment, every property. I want a complete picture that I can present to others." Now there was a brief pause. "I see. May I ask what's prompted this request?" "Let's just say I'm tired of hiding in plain sight," I replied. "It's time to live authentically, whatever the consequences." Harrison Financial Services occupied the top floor of a modest office building in downtown Oakland. I had deliberately chosen Philip precisely because his office wasn't in San Francisco or one of the wealthier suburbs where I might encounter acquaintances. For 30 years, I had parked my aging Toyota in the same visitor spot, taken the slightly creaky elevator to the 6th floor, and conducted my financial affairs with a level of privacy that bordered on secrecy. Today, as the elevator doors opened, onto the familiar reception area with its understated decor and discreet signage, I felt a distinct shift in my perspective. This place, which had once represented my necessary caution, now felt like the launching pad for a new chapter of openness. Meredith, the receptionist who had been with the firm almost as long as I'd been a client, greeted me warmly. "Mrs. Sullivan? So lovely to see you. Mr. Harrison is expecting you. Can I get you some tea?" "That would be wonderful, thank you." Philip met me at his office door, his tall frame slightly stooped now with age, his handshake as firm as ever. At 78, he had long since handed over most of his client list to younger advisors, but had kept a select few, including me. We had grown old together, in a sense, our professional relationship evolving into something closer to friendship over the decades. "Martha," he said, gesturing to the comfortable chair across from his desk. "Always a pleasure. Now, tell me what's prompted this sudden desire for transparency after all these years." I explained the Thanksgiving confrontation in detail, Marcus's ultimatum, his characterization of me as a burden, the thinly veiled attempt to access my assets while I was still very much alive and competent. Philip listened without interruption, his expression darkening as I recounted Marcus's threat of competency evaluations and conservatorship. "That's extremely concerning," he said when I finished. "Empty threats, of course. No court would entertain a conservatorship for someone in your condition, but concerning nonetheless. It suggests a willingness to pursue aggressive tactics to gain control of your assets." "Exactly," I agreed. "Which is why I need to change my approach. For decades, I've maintained the fiction of modest means partly out of habit and partly out of fear that transparency might damage my relationships with my children. But with Marcus, at least, the pretense has only enabled his worst tendencies." Philip nodded thoughtfully. "And your daughters? How do they factor into this decision?" "Rachel and Olivia have never shown the slightest interest in my finances beyond appropriate concern for my well-being," I said. "They've built their own lives, pursued careers they find meaningful rather than lucrative, and never once asked me for financial support beyond what any parent might reasonably provide for education and true emergencies. So you're planning to disclose your full financial situation to all 3 children at Christmas?" "Yes," I confirmed. But before that happens, I want to take some concrete steps to protect myself and remove any potential incentives for further attempts at financial manipulation. Philip's smile held a hint of pride. You've always been 3 steps ahead, Martha. What did you have in mind? First, I want to put the house in a trust that allows me lifetime use, but designates it as a future donation to the Oakmont Community College Scholarship Fund after my death. That removes it entirely from potential inheritance calculations. Easily. Done, Philip nodded, making notes. The house represents a relatively small portion of your assets anyway. What else? I want to establish clear, irrevocable directives for the bulk of my portfolio. 50% to be divided equally between Rachel and Olivia upon my death. 25% to specific charitable organizations I've supported over the years. The remaining 25% to be placed in a trust for Sophia's education and future needs, structured in a way that her parents cannot access or control the funds. And Marcus? Philip asked gently. You're excluding him entirely? I sighed, the weight of this decision heavy despite my certainty. No, that would only validate his worst suspicions about me and potentially damage his relationship with his sisters. I'll establish a modest trust for him as well, but with strict conditions and professional oversight that cannot be circumvented. Philip made additional notes, his expression thoughtful. These are all sound decisions, Martha, but they still don't address the immediate issue. Your public financial persona versus your actual wealth. How do you want to handle that discrepancy? That's where I need your help, I admitted. I want to emerge from the shadows, so to speak, but in a way that minimizes drama and prevents Marcus from claiming I've been deliberately deceiving him specifically. Philip leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled in the familiar gesture he used when considering complex problems. I believe I have just the solution. You mentioned you've been thinking about moving to Del Mar Shores? It's been a dream for years, I confirmed. I love the ocean, and the climate would be easier on my arthritis. But I've hesitated because it would raise too many questions about my finances. Perfect, Philip said, his smile widening. Here's what I propose. We'll create a narrative that combines truth and discretion. You recently received notification of a substantial inheritance from a distant relative. Technically true, since your own investments could be considered the fruits of Uncle Walter's original bequest. This unexpected windfall has allowed you to reconsider your retirement plans, including the possibility of coastal living. I considered the suggestion. That would explain the sudden change in my financial situation without revealing the decades of secret investing. Exactly. It provides a face-saving explanation for why you haven't previously lived in a manner consistent with your actual wealth. It also removes any implication that you've been specifically hiding assets from Marcus, as opposed to simply being the surprise recipient of a recent inheritance. I like it, I decided. It's close enough to the truth to feel authentic, but allows me to sidestep the more complicated explanations. Shall I arrange for a discreet property tour in Del Mar Shores next week? Philip asked. I have several contacts in luxury real estate who could show you appropriate options without drawing attention. Yes, I said, feeling a growing sense of excitement replacing the hurt and anger that had dominated the weekend. And I'd like to move quickly once I find something suitable. Ideally, I'd like to be settled in a new place before Christmas, when the children visit. Philip raised an eyebrow. That's an aggressive timeline, but not impossible with your financial resources. Are you certain you're ready to leave the family home after all these years? I thought about the craftsman house that had sheltered so many memories. Gregory's laugh echoing in the kitchen, children racing up and down the stairs, quiet evenings reading by the fireplace. For decades, I had preserved it as a shrine to our family life, maintaining the illusion that nothing fundamental had changed despite Gregory's death and the children's departure. But the truth was, that family no longer existed. Rachel and Olivia had created their own lives, returning as loving adults, but no longer dependent children. And Marcus had revealed himself to be someone I hardly recognized, someone who viewed the home I had preserved not as a place of love and memory, but as an asset to be liquidated for his benefit. "I'm ready," I said firmly. "The house holds wonderful memories, but it's time to create a new home that reflects who I am now, not who I was 30 years ago." "Very well," Philip said, making a final note. "I'll have the necessary paperwork drawn up for the trusts and begin arrangements for property viewings in Delmar Shores. Is there anything else we should address today?" I hesitated, then voiced the concern that had been growing since Thanksgiving. "I'm worried about Marcus's reaction when he learns the truth. Not physically, he's never been violent, but I wouldn't put it past him to escalate to legal challenges or other forms of pressure." Philip's expression turned serious. "A valid concern. I suggest we arrange a meeting with Elena Vasquez at Blackwell & Associates. She's an excellent elder law attorney who specializes in precisely these types of family situations. She can help ensure that all your arrangements are legally bulletproof and advise on strategies to minimize potential conflicts." "That would be very helpful," I agreed. "The sooner the better." As I left Philip's office an hour later, comprehensive, portfolio documentation in hand and appointments scheduled with both the real estate agent and the attorney, I felt a lightness I hadn't experienced in years. The painful confrontation with Marcus had forced me to acknowledge truths I had been avoiding and catalyzed changes I had too long postponed. For 30 years, I had lived a constrained version of my life, hiding my financial success out of habit, fear, and perhaps a lingering sense that wealth was somehow unseemly for a librarian, a teacher's widow, a woman of my generation and background. But that constraint had served its purpose, revealing essential truths about my children's characters that might otherwise have remained hidden. Now it was time to step fully into the life my prudence and foresight had created. Not to impress Marcus or change his fundamentally flawed perception of me, but to honor the woman I had become through decades of quiet discipline and careful planning. As I drove home, I found myself smiling at the delicious irony of the situation. Marcus had called me a burden, the most painful insult he could imagine. He had no idea that in 3 decades of managing my secret fortune, I had accumulated enough wealth to purchase his entire lifestyle many times over. By Monday morning, the plan I had outlined with Philip was already in motion. Elena Vasquez, the elder law attorney, had squeezed me into her schedule for a Tuesday consultation. The real estate agent had identified 3 potential properties in Delmar Shores that met my requirements. And most importantly, I had reclaimed my sense of agency and purpose after the momentary devastation of Marcus's cruel assessment. The confrontation that had been intended to diminish me had instead become the catalyst for my emergence from the shadows of self-imposed limitation. Marcus had called me a burden, but I was about to become something entirely different, a woman fully in command of her resources, her choices, and her future. The following weeks unfolded with remarkable speed, my life transforming more dramatically in 20 days than it had in the previous 20 years. With Philip's expert guidance and my newfound determination, obstacles that might once have seemed insurmountable were systematically addressed and overcome. Elena Vasquez, the elder law attorney Philip had recommended, proved to be exactly what I needed: brisk, efficient, and entirely unfazed by family dynamics that might have raised eyebrows elsewhere. "Your situation is hardly unique, Mrs. Sullivan," she said during our first meeting, reviewing my detailed notes on the Thanksgiving confrontation. "Adult children often develop a sense of entitlement to their parents' assets, particularly when they've made poor financial decisions themselves." "Should I be concerned about Marcus challenging my competency?" I asked, voicing the worry that had lingered despite Philip's reassurances. Elena shook her head firmly. "Based on what you've described, any such challenge would be frivolous. You're clearly competent, managing your own affairs, maintaining your home, driving independently, and making rational decisions about your future. More importantly, You have decades of documented financial acumen that directly contradicts any claim of diminished capacity. So there's nothing Marcus can do legally to interfere with my plans? Not successfully, Elena clarified. He could attempt various legal maneuvers, but they would be costly for him and unlikely to succeed. Our job is to create such a robust legal framework around your decisions that he's discouraged from even trying. Over the next week, Elena helped me establish an ironclad estate plan that included a revocable living trust for most of my assets, with detailed provisions for their distribution after my death, a durable power of attorney for financial matters, designating Rachel as my primary agent and Olivia as the secondary healthcare directives that clearly outlined my wishes and named my daughters as decision-makers, a separate educational trust for Sophia that neither Marcus nor Vanessa could access, or control deed transfer of my craftsman home to a charitable remainder trust benefiting the Oakmont Community College Scholarship Fund. This structure accomplishes several important objectives, Elena explained as I signed the final documents. It ensures your assets are used exactly as you intend, protects your daughters from potential conflict with their brother, provides for your granddaughter's education, and creates a meaningful legacy for future students. And makes it virtually impossible for Marcus to challenge successfully, I added. Elena's smile was measured but satisfied. That too. The documentation of your competency, including comprehensive neuropsychological testing, creates a strong presumption that your decisions reflect your true wishes and sound judgment. The neuropsychological evaluation had been Elena's suggestion, not because you need it, but because it creates a powerful preemptive defense. The results had been unequivocal. At 70, my cognitive abilities remained not just intact, but exceptional, particularly in areas related to financial decision-making and long-term planning. While the legal framework was being established, Philip arranged property viewings in Delmar Shores through his associate Diane Lockhart, a discreet real estate agent who specialized in high-net-worth clients. After touring several options via video conference, I flew to San Diego for a weekend to see the most promising properties in person. The moment I walked into the oceanfront condominium on the top floor of the Tides, I knew I had found my new home. Floor-to-ceiling windows showcased the Pacific in all its moody splendor, the sound of waves audible even through the premium insulation. The spacious open floor plan, with its chef's kitchen and expansive living areas, would be perfect for entertaining my daughters and their families when they visited. It's listed at $2.4 million, Diane said, watching my reaction carefully. But the owners are motivated sellers. I believe we could secure it for around $2.2 million with the right offer structure. The amount, representing less than 20% of my total portfolio, felt simultaneously enormous and entirely reasonable. For decades, I had lived in a home worth perhaps a tenth of this amount, driving cars that cost less than this property's sub-zero refrigerator. Yet here I was, calculating the purchase as a sensible allocation of my resources rather than an extravagance. I'd like to make an offer, I decided. With a quick closing, if possible. Diane nodded approvingly. Given your financial position, we can offer cash with minimal contingencies. That should be very attractive to the sellers, particularly if they're hoping to close before year-end for tax purposes. She was right. My offer was accepted the following day, with a closing date just 2 weeks away, December 18th, a week before Christmas. The timing couldn't have been more perfect for the family gathering I had planned. While the legal and real estate components of my plan proceeded with remarkable efficiency, the emotional aspects proved more complex. Marcus called 3 times in the week following Thanksgiving, each message more concerned than the last as I deliberately let them go to voicemail. Mom, just checking in to see how you're doing. Give me a call when you get a chance. Mom, we haven't heard from you in several days. Please call to let us know you're okay. Mom, we're getting worried. If we don't hear from you by tomorrow, we might need to drive over and check on you. The escalating concern might have seemed touching if I hadn't recognized the underlying pattern. Marcus had always used worry as a form of control, particularly when I established boundaries he found inconvenient. The implied threat in his final message, that he might need to come to my home uninvited, was entirely consistent with his approach to our relationship. After consulting with Elena, who advised maintaining documented communication without engaging in substantive discussion about my plans, I sent a brief text message. "I'm fine, just busy with some personal projects. No need to worry or visit. I'll be in touch when I'm ready to talk." His reply came almost instantly. "What personal projects? Are you okay? Vanessa and I are concerned about your state of mind after our conversation." The subtle implication that my reluctance to communicate might indicate diminished capacity was exactly the kind of manipulative tactic Elena had warned me about. Following her advice, I kept my response factual and brief. "My state of mind is excellent. I'm simply taking some time to consider our conversation and make appropriate plans for my future. I'll reach out when I'm ready to discuss further." I then contacted a home security company and had additional locks and a camera system installed, not because I truly feared Marcus would enter my home uninvited, but because Elena had emphasized the importance of documenting all protective measures. "If he later claims you were making paranoid decisions, we'll have evidence that your actions were reasonable precautions following his implied threats." The weeks before Christmas passed in a whirlwind of practical arrangements. I worked with a professional organizer to sort through 40 years of accumulated possessions, deciding what to keep, what to sell, what to donate, and what to offer my children. The process was surprisingly liberating. Each item considered and consciously chosen or released, each decision affirming my agency in creating this new chapter. I hired a respected estate sale company to handle the items I wouldn't be taking. To Del Mar Shores, with the proceeds designated for a nursing scholarship at Oakmont Community College. The sale was scheduled for early January, after I had shown my children any items they might want to claim. Throughout this period, Rachel and Olivia checked in regularly, their concern genuine but never intrusive. I kept them informed about my general plans. "I'm considering some significant changes in my living situation," without revealing the full extent of my financial circumstances. That conversation, I had decided, would happen when we were all together at Christmas. Marcus continued his campaign of escalating concern, eventually enlisting Richard's mother Elaine to call me, a particularly manipulative choice, as Elaine, and I had indeed been friendly over the years through school and community connections. "Martha, dear." Elaine's voice was warm but hesitant when I answered her call. "I hope you don't mind me phoning, but Marcus mentioned you might be going through a difficult time. He said you and the children discussed the possibility of you moving in with us." "That's not quite accurate, Elaine," I replied carefully. "Marcus and Vanessa suggested I sell my home and either move in with you or into assisted living. It wasn't so much a discussion as their presentation of options they had chosen for me." "Oh!" Elaine sounded genuinely surprised. "Richard and I certainly offered to help if needed. You know we have that lovely guest suite since the renovation, but I never imagined it would be presented to you as, well, as an ultimatum of sorts." "I appreciate your kindness," I said, sincerely. "But I'm quite capable of making my own arrangements. I hope Marcus hasn't put you in an awkward position." "Not at all," she assured me, though her tone suggested otherwise. "We just want what's best for you, Martha. You've been alone in that big house for so long." The conversation ended amicably enough, but it confirmed my suspicions about Marcus's tactics. He was creating a narrative about my declining capacity and inability to manage independently, laying groundwork for potential challenges to my decisions. By mid-December, all the major pieces were in place. My Del Mar Shores condominium purchase was proceeding smoothly toward the December 18th closing date. The legal framework Elena had created was properly executed and filed. I had sorted through decades of possessions, packed what would come with me to the new home, and arranged for the rest to be handled appropriately after Christmas. The most difficult task remained: telling my children about my decisions and revealing the financial reality I had kept hidden for 30 years. I scheduled the conversation for Christmas Day, when Rachel and Olivia would be visiting with their families. Marcus, Vanessa, and Sophia would join us for dinner. I had finally returned his calls and extended the invitation, which he had accepted, with obvious relief that our misunderstanding was apparently resolved. What Marcus didn't know, what none of my children yet knew, was that this would be the last family gathering in the craftsman home that had sheltered generations of memories. By the time they arrived for Christmas dinner, I would have already signed the papers for my oceanfront condominium and begun the irrevocable process of transferring the house to the charitable trust. The closing on the Tides penthouse unit proceeded. Exactly as planned on December 18th, Diane had arranged for a private signing at Philip's office, rather than the typical closing at a title company, another concession to my desire for discretion until I could inform my children properly. "Congratulations, Martha," Philip said, handing me the keys after the final document was signed. "You are now the owner of one of the most beautiful properties in Del Mar Shores." The reality of what I had done, committing over $2 million to a property purchase, still felt slightly surreal, despite the months of planning and consideration. For most of my adult life, financial decisions involving even a few $1,000s had required careful deliberation and occasional anxiety. Now, I had purchased a luxury condominium with the same measured confidence I might once have brought to buying a new refrigerator. "I think I'm still adjusting to this new reality," I admitted to Philip as we celebrated with a small glass of champagne after the closing. "For so long, I viewed my wealth as a theoretical safety net, rather than something to be actively enjoyed." Philip nodded understandingly. "That's not uncommon, especially for people who built their wealth slowly and carefully as you did. There's often a psychological barrier to actually using the resources you've accumulated. But remember, Martha, financial security isn't just about having money. It's about using it in ways that bring you security, comfort, and joy in accordance with your values." "You sound like my late husband," I said, smiling at the memory of Gregory's philosophical approach to life's resources. He always said money was meant to be fuel for experiences, not an end in itself. "A wise man," Philip agreed, "and I suspect he would be proud of how you've managed the family finances in his absence." The week before Christmas, I made one final trip to Del Mar Shores, arranging for essential furniture delivery and basic household setup so the condominium would be ready for my permanent move in January. Standing on the balcony overlooking the Pacific, watching dolphins play in the distance beyond the breaking waves, I felt a profound sense of rightness about my decision. This place, with its expansive views and peaceful atmosphere, represented not just a new home, but a new way of being in the world, visible, unapologetic, fully embodied in my choices and capabilities. For the first time since Gregory's death, perhaps even before, I was creating a life designed around my own needs and preferences rather than others' expectations or limitations. As I prepared to return to Oakland for the Christmas gathering that would change everything, I took one final moment on that balcony, breathing in the salt air and listening to the rhythmic pulse of the waves below. "I wish you could see this, Gregory," I whispered to the wind. "I think you would understand why it was time." The reply came not in words, but in the sudden flight of seagulls across my line of vision, their wings catching the late afternoon sun in a brief, beautiful illumination before they disappeared around the curve of the coastline. It wasn't a sign, of course. I had never been particularly mystical in my thinking, but it felt like an affirmation nonetheless. Back in Oakland, I spent the days before Christmas finalizing preparations for both the family gathering and my imminent revelation. Elena had provided a script of sorts for disclosing my financial situation, emphasizing the importance of presenting it as a positive development rather than a confrontation. "Frame it as sharing good news that benefits everyone," she advised. Focus on the opportunities your financial position creates for helping your granddaughter with education, contributing to causes you all value, and ensuring you'll never be a burden on any of your children. The subtle dig at Marcus's characterization of me wasn't lost on either of us, but Elena was right. This conversation needed to be about moving forward constructively rather than settling old scores, no matter how tempting the latter might be. Rachel and her family arrived first on Christmas Eve, their Vermont pragmatism evident in the carefully packed SUV they had rented for the drive from the airport. David carried their sleeping youngest son into the house while Rachel helped their daughter with the modest pile of gifts they had brought. "Mom, you look wonderful," Rachel said, embracing me warmly. "There's something different about you. Have you changed your hair?" "Just feeling good," I replied, though in truth I had treated myself to a professional styling at an upscale salon for the first time in decades. "How was your trip?" Olivia arrived an hour later, direct from the airport in a taxi, her journalistic efficiency evident in her minimal luggage and the way she immediately began helping with dinner preparations without being asked. At 42, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone comfortable in diverse settings around the world, her natural warmth balanced by an observant reserve that served her well professionally. "The house looks beautiful, Mom," she commented as we prepared vegetables for the Christmas Eve stew that had been our tradition since the children were small. "But different somehow. Have you been rearranging things?" Her perceptiveness didn't surprise me. Olivia had always noticed details others missed. In fact, I had been subtly preparing the house for its transition, removing personal photographs from some walls, streamlining bookshelves, creating a space that was still welcoming but slightly less personalized. "Just a bit of pre-holiday organizing," I said, which was true as far as it went. "How was Berlin? Your last email sounded like the assignment was challenging." Our Christmas Eve was peaceful and warm, filled with the comfortable rhythms of a family that genuinely enjoyed each other's company. We ate our traditional stew, played board games that had the children giggling and the adults competing with mock seriousness, and exchanged small gifts before the youngest ones were tucked into bed with promises that Santa would find them even away from home. Later, after David had taken their children upstairs and we three women sat together in the living room with cups of tea, I felt a familiar tug of maternal pride. My daughters had become such remarkable women. Rachel with her quiet strength and academic dedication, Olivia with her adventurous spirit and ethical compass. Whatever mistakes I might have made as a mother, whatever compromises and sacrifices the years had demanded, these two humans reflected the best of what Gregory and I had hoped to nurture. "I have something important to discuss with both of you tomorrow," I said finally, breaking the comfortable silence. "After Marcus and his family join us for dinner." Rachel and Olivia exchanged glances, a silent communication between siblings that I pretended not to notice. "Is this about what happened at Thanksgiving?" Rachel asked gently. "You mentioned a difficult conversation with Marcus." "Partly," I acknowledged. "But it's also about some decisions I've made that will affect all of us going forward." "Good decisions," I added, seeing concern flash across their faces. "Just significant ones." "Whatever it is, we're here for you, Mom," Olivia assured me, reaching over to squeeze my hand. "You know that, right?" I nodded, unexpectedly moved by their automatic support despite having no idea what I was about to reveal. This, I realized, was the fundamental difference between my relationships with my daughters and my increasingly troubled connection with Marcus. The underlying assumption of mutual respect and goodwill that informed our interactions even in uncertainty. Christmas morning brought the chaotic joy of children opening presents, a leisurely brunch, and a walk through the neighborhood to admire holiday decorations. The atmosphere remained relaxed and festive, though I caught occasional questioning glances from both daughters, their curiosity about my promised discussion evident but respectfully contained. Marcus, Vanessa, and Sophia arrived promptly at 4:00 for Christmas dinner, their entrance bringing a subtle shift in the household energy. Where before there had been easy laughter and comfortable silences, now there was a certain performative quality to the interactions, a carefulness in conversation that hadn't been necessary with just Rachel and Olivia's families. Martha, the house looks lovely as always, Vanessa commented, her gaze sweeping critically over the living room as she handed me a small, elegantly wrapped package. Though that loose banister rail really should be fixed. It's a safety hazard, especially with the little ones running around. The loose banister was news to me, but I merely smiled and thanked her for the gift, an expensive but impersonal scented candle from a luxury brand she favored. Marcus gave me a cursory hug, his attention already focused on greeting his sisters, while Sophia offered a shy smile and a handmade card that clearly represented more genuine thought than her parents' offering. Dinner was a carefully orchestrated affair. The conversation kept deliberately light as we navigated around the unspoken tension from Thanksgiving. Rachel and Olivia skillfully maintained the festive atmosphere, drawing Sophia into discussions about school and her interest in horseback riding, while David engaged Marcus on neutral topics related to their shared enthusiasm for golf. It wasn't, until we had finished dessert, my traditional trifle that even Vanessa deigned to eat despite her usual dietary restrictions, that I signaled it was time for the discussion I had planned. Before we moved to the living room for coffee, I have some news I'd like to share with all of you, I said, my voice steady despite the momentous nature of what I was about to reveal. Marcus immediately tensed, likely assuming this was about his Thanksgiving ultimatum. Rachel and Olivia exchanged another of their silent glances, then focused their attention supportively on me. Vanessa's expression shifted to one of barely concealed impatience, while the others around the table, David, and the children simply looked curious. First, I want to thank you all for being here today, I began, following the script Elena had helped me prepare. Family gatherings like this are precious, and I'm grateful we can share them despite our sometimes different perspectives. I paused, taking a sip of water to steady myself for the next part. As you know, I've lived in this house for 40 years. It's been a wonderful home, full of memories I treasure. But recently, I've been reconsidering my living situation and making some decisions about my future. Mom? Marcus started, but I held up a hand to gently stop him. Please, let me finish, Marcus. This is important. I turned to include everyone in my gaze. 3 weeks ago, I received unexpected news about a distant relative's estate. It seems that some property investments made decades ago have appreciated considerably, resulting in a significant inheritance. This was the narrative Philip and I had constructed, close enough to the truth to feel authentic while avoiding the more complicated explanation of 30 years of secret investing. After careful consideration, I've decided to make some changes that this unexpected financial blessing allows. First, I've purchased a condominium in Del Mar Shores, overlooking the ocean. I'll be moving there permanently in January. The reactions around the table were exactly as I might have predicted. Rachel and Olivia looked surprised but quickly shifted to happiness for me, understanding immediately why the oceanfront location would appeal. David nodded approvingly, having often heard me mention my love of the coast during family gatherings. Sophia seemed confused, but generally positive about the idea of a grandmother with a beach house. Marcus and Vanessa, however, displayed a complex mixture of emotions: shock, disbelief, calculation, and most notably, a growing suspicion that suggested they weren't entirely buying the sudden inheritance explanation. Del Mar Shores? Vanessa repeated, her voice carefully modulated but unable to completely hide her surprise. That's quite an exclusive area. This inheritance must be substantial. It is, I confirmed simply. Which brings me to the second part of my news. I've established several trusts that will benefit all of you in different ways. I proceeded to outline the basic structure Elena had helped me create. Education trusts for all the grandchildren, including Sophia. Eventual inheritance provisions for all 3 of my children. and the charitable foundation that would receive the family home and a portion of my investment portfolio. But the house, Marcus began, his voice tinged with the beginning of outrage. You can't just give away our family home to strangers. It's not going to strangers, I corrected gently. It's going to support nursing students at Oakmont Community College, creating a legacy that honors both your father's dedication to education and my years working in the college library. But what about our inheritance? He demanded, dropping all pretense of concern for my welfare. That house should stay in the family. Each of you will receive a significant inheritance when the time comes, I assured him, careful to include Rachel and Olivia in my gaze, though they had shown no sign of sharing his concerns. The trusts I've established ensure that, but the house itself will serve a different purpose, one that your father would have heartily approved. The conversation that followed was precisely as challenging as Elena had prepared me for. Marcus cycled through disbelief, anger, attempted manipulation. You're not thinking clearly about this, Mom. And finally begrudging acceptance as the reality of my resolved position became clear. Vanessa's reaction was more controlled, but equally revealing. Her questions focused almost exclusively on the financial details, her disappointment obvious. When I explained that the education trust for Sophia would be managed by a professional trustee rather than accessible to her parents. Throughout the difficult exchange, Rachel and Olivia remained supportive without directly confronting their brother, understanding instinctively that this was my stand to make. Only when Marcus suggested that I might be making impulsive decisions due to emotional distress after Thanksgiving did Rachel finally intervene. That's enough, Marcus, she said firmly. Mom has clearly thought this through carefully and consulted with appropriate advisors. The question isn't whether she's making sound decisions. The question is whether we can be supportive of choices that are ultimately hers to make. The evening ended earlier than our usual Christmas gatherings, with Marcus, Vanessa, and Sophia departing shortly after our discussion concluded. Sophia hugged me tightly before leaving, whispering, "I think your beach house sounds really cool, Grandma." A small moment of genuine connection that somewhat softened the tension of the evening. After they left, Rachel, Olivia, and I sat in the living room with fresh cups of tea, the weight of the revelation still hanging in the air between us. "So," Olivia said finally, her journalist's directness coming to the fore, "a sudden inheritance from a distant relative? That's the story we're going with?" I looked at my youngest daughter's perceptive expression and felt a surge of pride at her intelligence, combined with mild chagrin at being so transparent to her observant gaze. "It's not entirely untrue," I said carefully. "The original seed, money did come from Uncle Walter's property. It's just that the growth occurred over 30 years rather than appearing suddenly." Rachel nodded slowly, pieces falling into place. "You've been managing substantial investments all this time, haven't you, while living as if you were on a tight budget?" "I have," I confirmed, deciding that my daughters at least deserved the complete truth. "Initially out of caution after your father died, then out of habit, and eventually because it revealed important truths about how different people respond to perceived financial vulnerability versus abundance." "Marcus," Olivia said, "not a question, but a statement of understanding." "Among others," I agreed. "But yes, primarily Marcus. His response to what he believed was my financial limitation versus what he now knows to be my actual situation is illuminating. And not particularly flattering to him," Rachel added quietly. "Though not surprising, unfortunately." We talked long into the night, my daughters asking thoughtful questions about my decades of financial management, expressing admiration for my discipline and foresight rather than resentment for the years of perceived frugality. Their acceptance and understanding confirmed what I had always believed about their characters, that they valued people over possessions, relationship over resources. In the days that followed Christmas, as Rachel and Olivia's families enjoyed their planned vacation activities in the Bay Area, I began the final preparations for my transition to Del Mar Shores. The estate sale company cataloged remaining items, the real estate attorney finalized the charitable trust documentation, and I sorted through the last of the personal mementos I would take with me to my new home. Marcus called once after Christmas, his tone carefully conciliatory, though unable to completely mask his lingering resentment. "I've been thinking about our conversation, Mom. While I still think you could have handled this differently, I understand it's your decision to make. We should discuss the timing of your move and how Vanessa and I can help." The offer of help might have seemed generous if I hadn't recognized it for what it was, an attempt to reassert control over a process that had entirely escaped his management. Following Elena's advice about maintaining clear boundaries while avoiding unnecessary conflict, I thanked him politely but explained that all arrangements were already in place. The professional movers are scheduled for January 10th, and the ACI estate sale for unwanted items will happen the following weekend. Rachel will be coming back to help with the final details since she has that long weekend for the Martin Luther King holiday. "Rachel? Why not me? I live much closer," he objected, the familiar note of sibling rivalry evident in his voice. Rachel offered, and I accepted. I said simply, "But you and your family are welcome to visit me in Del Mar Shores once I'm settled. Perhaps during Sophia's spring break? The condominium has a lovely guest suite with its own bathroom." The invitation, genuine despite the complicated dynamics between us, seemed to mollify him somewhat. We ended the call on relatively amicable terms, though I harbored no illusions that our relationship had been magically repaired by this single conversation. As December turned to January and the reality of my imminent move approached, I found myself experiencing unexpected moments of nostalgia and doubt. Had I made the right decision? Was I abandoning the home where Gregory and I had built our life together? Would the ocean view and luxury amenities of Del Mar Shores truly compensate for leaving the familiar neighborhoods and routines of 40 years? These questions surfaced particularly in the quiet evenings after the holiday visitors had departed. As I moved through rooms increasingly emptied of personal touches, the house gradually transforming from home to property in preparation for its new purpose. One such evening, about a week before the scheduled move, I found myself in Gregory's study, a room I had preserved almost exactly as he had left it decades earlier. His books still lined the shelves, his ancient desk chair still waited at the roll-top desk where he had graded countless science tests and prepared lesson plans. Sitting in that chair, running my fingers over the worn wood of the desk, I felt a momentary wave of grief so acute it took my breath away, not just for Gregory, whose absence remained a permanent ache despite the decades, but for all that this house represented, the young couple we had been, the children racing through the hallways, the meals shared in the kitchen, the dreams, both realized and abandoned. "Am I doing the right thing?" I whispered aloud, half expecting the familiar walls to answer. The response came not from the house, but from within. A quiet certainty that had been building since that fateful Thanksgiving. Dinner. Yes, this house held precious memories, but those memories traveled with me, housed not in wood and plaster but in mind and heart. What remained here was simply structure, and that structure could serve a new purpose, creating opportunities for students who might otherwise never realize their potential. Meanwhile, I, Martha Sullivan, widow, mother, grandmother, financial autodidact, would continue writing my own story in a new setting, one that reflected not who I had been but who I had become and who I still might be. The oceanfront condominium wasn't a repudiation of my past, but an affirmation of my future. A place where my daughters and their families could gather for new memories, where I could watch dolphins from my balcony while sipping morning coffee, where I could finally live authentically, in the financial reality I had spent decades building. On January 10th, as the moving trucks pulled away from the craftsman home for the last time, I stood on the porch for a final moment of farewell. This place had sheltered me through marriage and motherhood, through widowhood and reinvention. It had witnessed my transformation from financially naive young wife to surprisingly savvy investor, from overwhelmed young widow to confident septuagenarian embarking on a new chapter. "Thank you," I whispered to the empty rooms behind me, "for everything." Then I walked down the familiar front steps, got into my car, the Toyota now replaced by a modest but new Subaru SUV more suitable for coastal living, and drove toward the future I had chosen for myself. A future built on decades of quiet determination, careful planning, and the courage to finally claim my own worth. Marcus had called me a burden at Thanksgiving, never suspecting that his cruel assessment would become the catalyst for my emergence from the shadows of self-imposed limitation. In attempting to diminish me, he had inadvertently freed me to become something entirely different. A woman fully in command of her resources, her choices, and her future. The irony was not lost on me as I merged onto the freeway heading south, toward my new home on the ocean. Sometimes the greatest gift comes disguised as rejection, and what others intend as limitation becomes the very key to unprecedented freedom. My first weeks in Del Mar Shores passed in a pleasant blur of unpacking, arranging and settling into new routines. The professional moving company had handled the transition with remarkable efficiency, placing furniture according to my prearranged floor plan and unpacking essentials so that my first night in the condominium felt surprisingly comfortable, rather than the chaotic camping experience I had half expected. The mornings quickly became my favorite time in this new space. I established a ritual of rising with the sun, brewing a pot of the premium coffee I now allowed myself without guilt, and taking it out to the balcony to watch the ocean awaken. Sometimes a marine layer would blanket the coast, creating a mystical landscape where the boundary between sea and sky blurred into infinite possibility. Other mornings brought crystalline clarity, the horizon sharply defined, dolphins occasionally visible as they arced through the waves with what seemed like pure joy. "Good morning," my next-door neighbor called one such morning, startling me from my reverie. I turned to see an elegant woman approximately my age, silver hair cut in a stylish bob, standing on her adjacent balcony with her own coffee cup. "I'm Margaret Chen. I've been meaning to introduce myself since you moved in." "Martha Sullivan?" I replied, smiling at this first overture from my new community. "It's lovely to meet you." "First time living oceanfront?" she asked with the knowing smile of someone who recognized the slightly dazed appreciation I still felt each morning. "Is it that obvious?" I laughed. "Only because I had that same expression for the first 6 months after we moved here from Chicago," Margaret confided. "My husband Edward insisted I was like a child with a new toy, getting up before dawn just to watch the sunrise." Our conversation flowed easily from there, the kind of natural connection between peers that I had rarely experienced in my old neighborhood, where young families had gradually replaced the aging friends who had once shared our life stage. Within 20 minutes, Margaret had invited me to join her walking group, mostly retired professional women, you'll fit right in, and the monthly book club that gathered in the condominium complex's community room. "Nothing too heavy," she assured me with a wink. "We claim it's about literary discussion, but it's equally about the wine and gossip." I accepted both invitations with genuine enthusiasm. While I had maintained casual friendships in Oakland, the demands of working while raising 3 children as a widow had limited my social connections primarily to family and long-established relationships. The prospect of building a new social circle among peers who knew nothing of my past, who would accept me simply as Martha, the new neighbor from Northern California with the lovely condominium and apparently comfortable means, was surprisingly appealing. The walking group proved to be exactly as Margaret had described, 7 women ranging in age from late 60s to early 80s, all physically active, intellectually engaged, and refreshingly direct in their conversations. Unlike the cautious social interactions I had grown accustomed to, where financial circumstances were delicately sidestepped or deliberately obscured, These women discussed investment strategies and vacation properties with the same comfortable candor they applied to health concerns and family dynamics. "My financial advisor keeps pushing me toward more conservative investments," complained Judith, a retired corporate attorney, during one morning walk along the beach. "I keep reminding him that at 74, I'm potentially looking at another 20 years of life. I need growth as much as stability." "Exactly," agreed Eleanor, who had introduced herself as a former mathematics professor. "Too many advisors see gray hair and immediately start talking income preservation, as if our only remaining goal is to avoid becoming a burden on our children." The casual use of that word, burden, no longer carried the sting it once had. The 3 months since that painful Thanksgiving confrontation with Marcus, I had reclaimed my narrative so thoroughly that his cruel assessment now seemed more revealing of his character than mine. These new friendships, built on mutual respect rather than obligation, further reinforced my conviction that age was not synonymous with dependency. My relationship with my children evolved in different ways as they adjusted to both my relocation and the revelation of my financial circumstances. Rachel and Olivia adapted quickly, our weekly phone calls maintaining their familiar warmth with the added excitement of planning their summer visits to the grandma's beach house that their children now spoke of with delighted anticipation. "Mom, I have to tell you something," Rachel confided during one such call in late February. "I'm actually relieved about your financial situation. David and I had been setting aside a portion of our savings each month in case you needed care. Eventually, we never wanted you to worry about becoming dependent on us." "Oh, sweetheart," I said, moved by this revelation. "That was completely unnecessary but incredibly thoughtful." "Well, now we're putting it toward the kids' college funds instead," she said cheerfully, "and planning a slightly more extravagant summer vacation with you than we might have otherwise. The children are beyond excited about tide pools and dolphin watching." Olivia's adjustment took a different form, expressed during her weekend visit in March as we walked along the shore. "You know," she said, pausing to watch a flock of sandpipers scurrying along the water's edge, "your story has completely changed how I think about my own financial future. I've always focused on experiences over assets. Figured I'd rather spend on traveling to Syria for an important story than save for some theoretical future." "That approach has given you an extraordinary career in life," I pointed out. "It has," she agreed. "But watching you create this new chapter, seeing how your careful planning has given you such freedom in what could otherwise be a vulnerable time, it's made me reconsider the balance. I opened my first serious investment account last month." "Really?" I couldn't hide my surprise. Olivia had always been almost defiantly uninterested in financial matters. "Don't worry, I'm not giving up international assignments for a corporate job," she laughed, correctly interpreting my expression. "But maybe I can have both. The meaningful work I love and long-term security. You've shown me that's possible." My conversations with Marcus remained more complicated, a delicate dance of surface cordiality covering unresolved tensions. He called regularly, his tone deliberately casual as he inquired about my adjustment to coastal living and reported on Sophia's activities, but I noted that he no longer discussed his personal financial challenges or made oblique requests for assistance as had been his pattern for years. Our most honest exchange came in April, when he visited alone, notably without Vanessa, ostensibly to deliver some family photographs he had found while reorganizing their home office. "The place looks great, Mom," he said, his gaze sweeping across the open-concept living area with its panoramic ocean views. "Really suits you." "Thank you," I replied simply, noting that he had positioned himself near the floor-to-ceiling windows, perhaps unconsciously seeking to assess the property's value. "I'm very happy here." After some minutes of rather stilted conversation about Sophia's school achievements and his recent work projects, Marcus finally broached the subject that had clearly been simmering beneath the surface. "I've been thinking a lot about Thanksgiving," he said, carefully not meeting my eyes. "About what I said." I waited, giving him space to continue without prompting. I shouldn't have called you a burden, he finally said, the word seeming difficult for him. That was unfair. It wasn't quite an apology. The phrasing neatly avoided taking full responsibility for the hurt his words had caused. But it was perhaps as close as Marcus could come given his pride and the complex tangle of his feelings about my newly revealed financial status. Thank you for saying that, I responded, choosing not to push for more explicit acknowledgement of the harm done. I appreciate you making the trip to tell me. A slightly uncomfortable silence followed, broken when Marcus gestured toward the ocean view and asked, "So what made you choose this place specifically? There must have been lots of options with your inheritance." I noted his slight hesitation before the word inheritance, suggesting he still harbored doubts about the narrative Philip and I had constructed to explain my sudden financial emergence. But I merely smiled and answered the question at face value, describing my love of the ocean view and the appeal of the condominium's amenities. As he prepared to leave an hour later, Marcus paused at the door, seeming to struggle with something he wanted to express. "You know, I always assumed I'd need to take care of you eventually," he said finally. "It was stressful, wondering how we'd manage it with our other financial commitments." The statement hovered somewhere between explanation and justification for his Thanksgiving behavior, not quite an apology, but an attempt at providing context. "I understand," I said, choosing compassion over correction, despite noting that his phrasing still centered his experience rather than mine. "But, as you can see, I've always been quite capable of taking care of myself." "Clearly," he replied with a small laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes. "More than capable. I just wish—" He trailed off, but I could fill in the unspoken conclusion. "I just wish you had shared this information sooner. I just wish I had known there was no need to worry. I just wish I hadn't revealed myself so thoroughly in what I thought was your vulnerability." "We all make choices based on the information we have at the time," I said gently, "including me." The subtle reminder that my decades of financial privacy had been a deliberate choice rather than an oversight seemed to register. Marcus nodded, once, kissed my cheek in a perfunctory gesture, and departed with a promise to arrange a visit with Vanessa and Sophia once the school year winds down. As I closed the door behind him, I felt neither the vindication I might once have imagined, nor the lingering hurt of our Thanksgiving confrontation. Instead, I experienced a quiet acceptance that our relationship would likely never achieve the easy closeness I enjoyed with my daughters, but perhaps could evolve into something more honest than it had been, a connection based on who we actually were rather than who we had pretended to be for each other's benefit. That evening, as I sat on my balcony watching the sunset paint the Pacific in improbable shades of gold and crimson, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. The financial security I had spent decades building in secret had indeed provided the freedom and independence I had hoped for. But the true liberation had come from something less tangible than wealth, from finally allowing myself to be seen clearly, to occupy space unapologetically, to create a life designed around my own needs and preferences rather than others' expectations or limitations. Margaret's voice called from the neighboring balcony, interrupting my musings. "Martha, Edward and I are having impromptu cocktails with some friends from the walking group. Care to join us?" "I'd love to," I replied, rising from my chair with a smile. This, too, was part of my new reality: spontaneous social invitations, genuine connections with peers who took my competence for granted, friendships built on mutual interests rather than shared history or family obligation. As I gathered my sweater and locked my door, I felt a profound gratitude for the painful catalyst that had forced me from the shadows of self-imposed limitation. Marcus had called me a burden that Thanksgiving, never imagining that his cruel assessment would become the very key to unprecedented freedom. In attempting to diminish me, he had inadvertently propelled me toward a life more authentic and fulfilling than I had dared to imagine for myself. The irony was perfect in its symmetry. Sometimes rejection becomes invitation, sometimes loss becomes opportunity, and sometimes the ending of one story creates space for a far better one to begin. Summer arrived with a vibrancy that seemed to mirror my own blossoming life in Del Mar shores. The June gloom that locals had warned me about, the marine layer that often blankets the coast during early summer, proved to be a gentle introduction to the season, rather than the oppressive presence I had feared. The mornings might begin with mist, but by afternoon, the sun invariably broke through, revealing the ocean in all its sparkling glory. My condominium had become truly home, no longer a novelty or a statement, but simply the place where I belonged. I had arranged my favorite pieces from the craftsman house, Gregory's reading chair, the grandfather clock that had been a wedding gift, the handcrafted bookshelf he had built during Rachel's infancy, among the new furnishings chosen specifically for this space. The result was a seamless blend of cherished past and vibrant present, much like my life itself. The promised family visits began in July, bringing a joyful chaos that filled the spacious rooms with laughter and movement. Rachel and David arrived first with their children, 11-year-old Thomas and 8-year-old Emma, their Vermont pallor gradually giving way to golden California tans as days passed in a pleasant rhythm of beach explorations, pool swimming, and evening board games on the balcony. "Mom, this place is magical," Rachel said one evening as we sat watching the sunset while the children built an elaborate sand castle on the beach below, visible from our vantage point. "I've never seen the kids so relaxed and happy. Thomas hasn't mentioned his video games once since we arrived." "The ocean has that effect," I replied, thinking of my own transformation over the past 6 months. "It puts things in perspective somehow." David joined us, handing each of us a glass of wine. "We've been talking," he said, exchanging a meaningful glance with Rachel, "about making this an annual tradition, a couple of weeks here every summer. Would that be all right with you, Martha?" "More than all right," I assured them, warmed by the request. "Nothing would make me happier than knowing I'd have this time with you every year." Olivia arrived the day before Rachel's family departed, creating a perfect overlap for a multi-generational family dinner that reminded me of holiday gatherings in our old home, but without the underlying tensions that had often accompanied those occasions. Even Olivia, usually restless after a few days in any location, seemed to settle into the rhythm of coastal life with unusual contentment. "I've been thinking about property values in this area," she mused one morning as we walked along the shore. "I might look into a small place nearby. Something I could rent out when I'm traveling but use as a home base when I'm between assignments." "Really?" I couldn't hide my surprise. Olivia had always been determinedly untethered, her few possessions stored in her small New York apartment or carried in her well-traveled luggage. She laughed at my expression. "Don't worry, I'm not suddenly becoming domestic, but I've realized having roots somewhere beautiful doesn't have to mean being trapped. It might actually give me more freedom, knowing I have a place that's truly mine to return to." I recognized, in her words, an echo of my own journey, the discovery that security and independence were not opposing forces but complementary aspects of a well-designed life. "I think that sounds wonderfully balanced," I told her. "And selfishly, I'd love having you nearby more often." The anticipated visit from Marcus, Vanessa, and Sophia came in late July, approached with a mixture of hope and trepidation on my part. Our phone conversations since Marcus's solo visit had been cordial, but somewhat distant, and I wasn't sure what to expect from this longer family stay. To my pleasant surprise, the visit proved more relaxed than I had dared to hope. Sophia's genuine delight in the beachfront location seemed to set a positive tone from the moment they arrived, her adolescent enthusiasm temporarily overwhelming the lingering awkwardness between the adults. "Grandma, this place is incredible," she exclaimed, running from window to window to take in the views before dashing out to the balcony. "Can I go down to the beach right now? Please?" Her excitement was infectious, and soon we were all walking along the shore, Sophia running ahead to examine interesting shells and peer into tide pools, while the three adults maintained a comfortable conversation about neutral topics: the drive down from Oakland, the unusually mild weather, the architectural features of the condominium complex. It wasn't until the third day of their visit, during an unexpected moment alone with Vanessa while Marcus took Sophia shopping for a replacement swimsuit, that I glimpsed a more substantial shift in our family dynamic. "I want to apologize," Vanessa said as we sat on the balcony with morning coffee, the statement so unexpected that I nearly spilled my drink. In our decades of knowing each other, I couldn't recall Vanessa ever apologizing for anything. "For Thanksgiving," she continued when I remained silent, clearly surprised. "The things Marcus said about you being a burden, I encouraged that perspective. I wanted your house for the equity, and I convinced Marcus we deserved it more than some charity." The candor was startling, but I appreciated it more than a polished, less honest expression of regret. "Thank you for telling me that," I said carefully. "I was raised to believe that family money should stay in the family," she continued, looking out toward the horizon rather than at me. "My father lost everything because he trusted the wrong people with our family wealth. I've always been protective of what I see as ours." "I understand that perspective," I said, thinking of the complex motivations that had shaped my own financial secrecy over the decades. "Though I obviously don't share it." "Clearly," she agreed with a small laugh that held more self-awareness than bitterness. "You know, when we first learned about your inheritance and the Del Mar property, I was convinced you were punishing us for Thanksgiving, showing us what we could have had if we'd been nicer to you." "That wasn't my intention," I assured her, though I could understand how it might have appeared that way. "I know that now," Vanessa said, meeting my eyes directly for perhaps the first time in our relationship. "Watching you here, seeing how you've built this new life that has nothing to do with proving anything to anyone, it's made me rethink some things." She hesitated, then added, "Marcus and I have started financial counseling. We're trying to live more within our means, save for Sophia's college instead of assuming family money will take care of it. It's challenging, but necessary." This glimpse of vulnerability and growth from Vanessa, whom I had always perceived as calculating and materialistic, was perhaps the most unexpected development in a year filled with surprises. It reminded me that people, like investments, contain potential for growth that isn't always immediately apparent. The remainder of their visit unfolded with a genuine warmth I hadn't experienced with Marcus and Vanessa in years, perhaps ever. While we didn't discuss the inheritance narrative or the painful Thanksgiving confrontation directly, there was an unspoken acknowledgement that something fundamental had shifted in our family system. The power dynamics had rebalanced, creating space for more authentic connections built on mutual respect rather than financial expectations or obligations. On their final evening, as we enjoyed dinner at a restaurant overlooking the ocean, Marcus raised his glass in an unexpected toast. "To new beginnings," he said, his gaze meeting mine with what appeared to be genuine affection. "And to learning from our mistakes." "To new beginnings," we all echoed, Sophia's adolescent voice blending with the adults in a moment of harmony that felt symbolic of our evolving family narrative. After they departed the next morning, I took my usual walk along the shore, reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this point. A year ago, I could never have imagined the dramatic shifts in both my external circumstances and internal landscape. From a widow carefully guarding her financial secrets in an aging craftsman, home to a woman fully embracing her prosperity in an oceanfront condominium, from someone defined primarily by her relationships to others, to a person centered in her own authentic identity and choices. The catalyst for this transformation had been painful. Marcus's cruel assessment of me as a burden had cut deeply, exposing the limitations of a relationship built on incomplete understanding and unexamined assumptions. Yet from that wound had flowered this unexpected new life, richer and more fulfilling than I could have anticipated. As I walked, I noticed a group of elderly women practicing Tai Chi on the beach, their movements flowing with the rhythm of the waves. Margaret had mentioned this morning class, suggesting I might enjoy joining them. Watching their graceful forms against the backdrop of the Pacific, I made a mental note to ask her about the schedule. This, I realized, was the true luxury my financial security had provided. Not the premium appliances or ocean views, lovely as they were, but the freedom to continuously reinvent myself, to explore new interests and connections, to build a third act limited only by imagination rather than resources. I thought of Uncle Walter's barren desert parcels that had seemed so worthless when I inherited them, yet contained the seeds of everything I now enjoyed. "Land is the only thing they aren't making any more of, Marty," he had written in his final letter. How right he had been, though not perhaps in the way he had imagined. The land I now occupied wasn't just the valuable real estate beneath my condominium, but the expansive territory of a life fully claimed, a landscape of possibilities that continued to reveal new vistas with each passing day. At 71, I had discovered that age could be a beginning rather than an ending, a time of harvest rather than decline. As I turned to head back home, I saw a young family setting up for a day at the beach, parents struggling with chairs and umbrellas while two small children danced impatiently at the water's edge. The mother, looking harried but determined, caught my eye and smiled in that universal expression of parental mixed feelings. I smiled back, remembering those days of young motherhood with all their exhaustion and joy. For a moment, I saw myself in her. The younger Martha, who had believed that motherhood would be her primary identity, who could never have imagined the independent, prosperous woman she would become decades later. I wanted to tell her that the story wouldn't unfold as she expected, that there would be challenges and heartbreaks, but also triumphs and joys she couldn't yet envision. Instead, I simply returned her smile and continued on my way, leaving her, to discover her own path, just as I had discovered mine. Some journeys can't be shortcuts. They must be lived in their entirety, with all their unexpected turns and revelations. The morning sun had burned away the marine layer completely now, revealing the coastline in perfect clarity all the way to the distant headland. I paused for a moment, taking in the panoramic beauty of my new home, filled with gratitude for the painful honesty that had ultimately led me here. Marcus had called me a burden, but in doing so, he had inadvertently set me free from the constraints of others' expectations, free from the limitations of my own carefully constructed facade, free to finally live as the woman I had always been beneath the surface. Capable, prosperous, and entirely her own. I took a deep breath of salt air and continued toward home, each step carrying me further into this unexpected new chapter, this third act that promised to be the most authentic and fulfilling of all. Not because it erased what had come before, but because it integrated all of it, the joys and sorrows, the successes and failures, the masks and revelations, into a life fully and unapologetically lived. The ocean stretched before me, its horizon, line a reminder that endings and beginnings are often indistinguishable from one another, and in that knowledge lay perhaps the greatest freedom of all, the understanding that my story wasn't concluding but continuously unfolding, each day bringing new possibilities limited only by the boundaries of my own imagination. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.